Hello, I'm Lorie Karnath, the managing editor of Molecular Frontiers Journal. Today, I'm with Professor Bengt Norden, who serves as the journal's editor-in-chief. Professor Norden is a physical chemist, a member of the Royal Swedish Academy, the former chair of the Nobel Committee for Chemistry, as well as chairs the NTU Research Council in Singapore. Recently, Molecular Frontiers Journal published Professor Norden's paper titled Mitigating Climate Change, a Global Approach. It's this article that has brought us together today. Welcome, Bengt.
Thank you.
So your paper, which you have offered as a basis for discussion, outlines an interesting perspective and approach to climate change that differs significantly in many ways from the path that some nations and governments are taking. What is the basis for your considerations?
Well, first I should humbly admit that I'm just a physical chemist. I'm not a climate expert. And the fact that there are things I do not understand or even question about the way climate policies are pursued does not necessarily mean that they are wrong. However, I think a lot of what has been said when discussing what is acceptable as renewable or sustainable is confusing and does not take a global grasp and does not look for the simplest feasible solutions. I look for solutions and not barriers, but I'm just using common sense. It's nothing in what I write that requires very deep theory.
Okay, so we'll get back to maybe why not everybody sees the simplest solution and uses common sense. But first, let's look at some of the goals that you mention. You list a number of points as well as goals that we should perhaps follow and help us to understand what's ahead for us. As the first goal, you list the stopping of all use of all carbon-containing fuels, including natural gas and other fossil products. Many agree with this, but how feasible is it?
Yeah. First, I should say that with my 15 theses, I protest against a system of political legislation that reminds of the Catholic Church indulgence letters, giving people opportunity to buy themselves amnesty. The Europe trading system, for instance, a market for outlet rights, or Europe's taxonomy for sustainable activities are examples of, as I see it, orthodox climate bureaucracy, which I protest against. So if you take my first thesis, you didn't say the last thing, namely that the carbon-containing fuels included so-called biofuels. And biofuels is, again, something that it's almost like an indulgence letter. You could buy yourself free if you grow some crops and harvest them and then make fuels of them. Then the carbon dioxide the photosystem has absorbed is then released again. And in that way, it's carbon neutral. However, the biofuels produce as much or even more carbon dioxide as fossil fuels do. But as you ask, when could we do this? This is, of course, a long-term goal. But we must have the target in view all the time. And all the way we work, we should think of how we could optimize this goal.
Yes. Well, the reason why I didn't mention biofuels right up front, because I think that the stopping of natural gas and other fossil products is already a huge consideration. And I know biofuels is something that has more emotional and political support at present. So that is perhaps a separate discussion, but what you say is that biofuels are not so carbon neutral as many think. and that you find that a better path is a more direct solution. Is that correct?
That's correct. And my second thesis says we must electrify society and industry. Electricity from only non-carbon based power. And of course, you could say that electricity could be supported with clean hydrogen gas. I could have put that into that thesis too. But so the electricity is what we should look for. And if you take, for instance, Germany, who has more or less annihilated nuclear power and now is very much depending on natural gas, we have the problem how to compensate this lack of energy sources that if we exclude the natural gas. And my recipe there is to use solar power, but not harvested in Germany, but at latitudes where we have many sun-rich days and where the latitude angle also increases the efficiency. And I'm thinking about the desert of Sahara.
Okay, so however, if we think about that, again, as you mentioned earlier, these are longer term solutions, but to install solar and wind systems takes quite a bit of power on its own, and requires more building materials than perhaps even nuclear. So how do you, you say that solar should be given among the highest priorities. How do we overcome some of these obstacles?
Yeah, you compare with nuclear. That's a bad comparison because nuclear energy, the constructions take time. It's 10, 20, 30 years. Whereas solar, with solar panels, it's relatively fast. There is an industry behind, and that's always a good point. So putting up solar panels in Africa will go quite quickly. We have a project in Australia, where Australia in desert arid areas, huge areas of solar panels are installed now, and a cable, an electric cable, will deliver electricity to Singapore, which is 4,000 kilometers away. So it is feasible. It will take some time and it will be costly, but this is something we have to live with. We have to sacrifice. It will cost, but we will harvest the cost. It will be a blessing in the long run.
So if we go back to nuclear power, for many, nuclear power is seen as a difficult option. If we look at France, for example, that produces more nuclear power per capita than any other country, they're having difficulties at present with some of the challenges that they faced even this summer from climate change, reduce some of the ability to use water to cool these nuclear reactors. Not only that, the government is not always supporting this idea of nuclear. So what do you see going forward for nuclear? Do you think that science can make these plants more efficient? What do you see to make nuclear a bit more palatable?
Well, I think those who are fortunate to have nuclear power, they should nurse their powers and keep it as long as possible. To start from scratch, building up nuclear power in a country, I think will take too long time. You have the example of Finland, whose reactor is now, I think, on year 30 and still not finished. I doubt we should invest in new reactors. But you mentioned the problem of cooling the current reactors in France, and that is indeed an issue if the rivers with lack of water. And this brings me to another topic, another thesis I have, and that's that we must prepare ourselves for changes. For instance, melting of land ice will raise sea levels, and should we could mitigate this problem, I suggest, by building freshwater reservoirs around the world. And I think that could be a blessing to many people because we have lack of fresh water. In France, I would recommend the same thing, that we have reservoirs close to the nuclear power stations. So in case we have a very dry summer, we should not need to turn off the cooling.
So how do you envision these reservoirs, above ground type facilities? Because you also state that as the seawater rises, how do we retain water and fresh water?
Yeah. I think about the ground, and I think one could combine such freshwater reservoirs with another possibility to store energy. And that it's called pump storage hydroelectric energy, PSH, which means, and that has been used in Switzerland for a very long time at small scale, and now it's coming in other countries. Wales has one, and so on. So it means that when you have plenty of electricity, you pump up water and you use the potential energy to get the storage, hydroelectric storage, and then when you on demand, you let out the water through the turbines and harvest the electricity that way.
You mentioned that we need to be realistic, that these are longer term solutions, and that we need to prepare ourselves for changes, that even if we were to stop all activities that produce carbon dioxide emissions, that there would be significant lag effects. What do you see these as?
Yeah, that's at least my suspicion. Everything goes very slowly, and something that people do not agree about is the land ice melting. If the Antarctic ice, all of it melts, we would expect a rise of, I've calculated 58 meters of all our oceans, or 55 if I let the shores be rather shallow and 10 kilometers broad. So it's not a big difference, 55 or 58 meters. That's a lot. Now, several experts have said that this will never happen. The ice will not melt totally. But I think we should still be aware of the risk, and I think we should work for the worst scenario as a possibility. So in that case, you have to install many freshwater reservoirs. I would say around 1 million around the world.
If the water were to rise by 55 or 58 meters, or even a fraction of that, many capitals around the world would be flooded. What do you see as the time frame for that, and what period would there be to start establishing these reservoirs if indeed that becomes a solution?
I've looked at several places, and the melting rate is very slow. I think in the next 20 years we will not notice any big differences, but you never know. And some people say that if we exceed the Paris Agreement goal of less than 2 degrees raise since 1850, I think it started, then we may have passed a tipping point, and the melting may increase. But clearly, Arctic ice is melting.
So what do you think the possibilities are to adhere to the Paris Agreement?
Well, I'm optimistic. I think if we can convert to a total electric plan, electrifying society and industry, as I suggest in my paper, I've worked through 13 countries or states by the end, and I I list the current energy sources, and then I suggest an alternative that should cover all energy. That means not only the electric energy as usual in homes and industry and so on, but also driving the cars, driving them electrically. And that normally goes beyond twice the current electric energy budget. So I've done that for these 13 countries, and suggest that generally solar energy is the main complementary source that is used. And it would be very interesting to get responses from these states and countries whether they think this is feasible.
Since you mentioned the use of electric cars, how do we produce batteries for these cars when there's limited amount of materials for these?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Maybe it's not possible. Maybe we have to go over to use hydrogen as a fuel. Hydrogen is environmental friendly. It combines with oxygen in the air and forms just water as the exhaust. And if you do it in a fuel cell, it's extremely clean process. But the problem is then to store the hydrogen. You have to have it in cylinders compressed at 300 atmospheres or something like that. And it is an issue. You can't drive extremely far on these cars compared to the electric cars.
Okay, so you, in your paper, you speak about the total balanced energy budget. Could you explain a little bit how this works and how you see this being developed in different places around the world? The criteria that you talk about with priorities on feasibility, significance, environmental friendliness will differ significantly dependent upon where you might be. So maybe you could describe this a little bit.
Yeah, what I've done is that I've looked at the current situation in each country. And if we take Norway, for instance, at the top comes the hydroelectric power. It's 96%. That's an enormously high contribution from a source that is completely environment friendly. And then I've done this for each state, and the highest percentage is, of course, in the top. Then I look for the figure I would need to get the total coverage of all energy. That means to the fuel to cars and trucks and so on. And it's a very crude calculation, but normally it's roughly double the size of the electric energy. And then I looked around for feasibility. If we take Ukraine, for instance, it has this country has an enormous contribution from nuclear power. And that's, of course, an asset, but at the same time, to live up to running all the cars, you would need some electric energy either to be stored in the batteries or to produce the hydrogen to be stored in the cars. And looking around for solar energy sources, I would go for Crimea. That's an area which a lot of sun, many sun hours per hour per year, and which would top up what's needed for Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Generally, you could find some desert areas quite close by in most countries. And if not, you could, as I suggest we do in Sweden, we take up a project with people in Africa and have a collaboration on the industrial basis to produce electricity in Sahara, or use the electricity to produce hydrogen. An alternative to sending electric power in electric cables is to by use electrolysis of water, produce hydrogen that you could transfer in tubes or via shipping and so on.
So this seems like it requires a tremendous amount of discussion and coordination amongst nations. So what do you see as what discussions need to take place? And is there a scientific template that could be developed and perhaps distributed through some organization? What do you see as a feasible plan for getting people to start talking about this?
Yes, everybody needs to be involved to deploy a global action. That's for sure. Who it should be, I don't know. It could be United Nations. It could be the World Bank. I see many organizations who might be interested. Even the Club of Rome have interests in these areas, but it's extremely important that one solves economic and political challenges, allowing and promoting establishment of required international energy collaborations. For instance, cross-continental energy transport. This is the big challenge. I can't see that the current governments who have their plates filled by their own countries are extremely extrovert and works in this direction. Here we have to change the way we think.
So how quickly do you think it's possible to alter the course that we're currently on?
Yeah, that's the $10 million question. Of course, I think that the engineering, the technology could work along the same lines as the Singapore-Australia project, which is I think, 7-year project. But the collaboration project, I have no idea. This is outside my realm of expertise, I must say.
So let me ask you this. Do we have time? And what do you see as the best scenario?
I think the best scenario is to start immediately planning the alternative sources, including the solar energy, which I think is the simplest. People speak about tipping points. I don't know whether an increase in temperature would bring us into something irreversible state, from which we cannot recover by lowering the temperature. Of course, extinction of species, that's irreversible. But in contrast to the opposite, if we lower the temperature of the Earth low enough so that the irradiation exchange will tend to make the whole Earth white, we will go into an infinite ice age. In contrast to that, I think even if we go above the Paris Agreement 2 degrees, it's possible to repair, but it will cost a lot. Just the water flooding countries and capitals and so on will be an enormous economical catastrophe and human catastrophe. Many low-lying countries, Bangladesh and so on, will suffer a lot, and there will be migration. So the demographic dimension is very important to include here. I have not done that in my article, and I'm not an expert, but there are people who would know how to do this, because this is extremely important when you design a solution, a global solution.
So what happens if we continue on the path that we're currently on and don't make these changes?
It's catastrophe.
And in what window? What window of time?
It's very difficult to say. It could accelerate suddenly. We know the hockey club temperature shape, and things could happen quicker than when we know. There are lots of models, but they are very complicated, and they include assumptions that I wouldn't say I don't trust them, but assumptions are always difficult, and prognosis are very difficult, especially about the future.
So what can we do as individuals?
I think being aware and involving ourselves in the discussion, and also take part in facts. I mean, the technology, this is not rocket science. This is something everybody can understand. Although the climate science itself, the climate itself is very complex. There are so many processes. The nuts and bolts are not difficult to understand. And I think it's important that everybody, especially the kids in the schools, are brought up to a scientific way of thinking. And they will come with new ideas, maybe. All contributions are needed. Everybody needs to be involved.
So I think one problem with that is that it's very difficult for some people, the layperson who doesn't have a strong scientific background, to know what is the right direction and what is not the right direction. There's so many differences of opinions. And as you mentioned, a lot of the scientific models and research aren't necessarily completely accurate, as we're still learning. So how does the average person know what direction to go in?
I have no recommendations. I'm just protesting against a system that I think is hijacked, not by the technology-educated people, but lawyers and economists. I may be wrong, but I think if people are open-minded and critical, and I think if they read my article, they begin to think.
Okay, so if you can summarize, what is your scientific recipe going forward, the best case scenario?
The best case scenario is, as quickly as possible, go into an electrification of the society and industry, and developing energy sources that are environmental friendly. And I think the top one is the solar energy. It could be installed locally, but the efficiency and the fact that it takes space, you should not use land that could be used for growing grain in Sweden, for instance. You should not use that for solar panels. You should put them somewhere else where you have a lot of sun. This is what I suggest. Of course, the others, wind power is extremely important, but it's intermittent in a completely unpredictable way. And we all know that when the temperature, at least here in Scandinavia, drops below -20 degrees Celsius, there is no wind. And that's when the homes needs to be heated. And then we have to trust nuclear power and hydroelectric power.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for your time and your article, and I hope that it puts us on a faster, safer course towards protecting the planet. And we look forward to hearing more about your total balanced energy budget, and hopefully the right groups around the world can be engaged. So thank you again. And thank you to World Scientific and Sue Lafan for helping us today.
Thank you.